Good evening, everyone. I'm Sana. My research takes an interdisciplinary approach to understanding how historical trauma affects the human body, specifically in South Asian contexts. Historical trauma events are events that cause specific communities significant amounts of harm. These events are perpetrated with destructive intent, usually by outsiders. This framework has been applied to situations like the Holocaust and the colonization of Americas. The specific historical trauma event that I'm interested in is partition in South Asia. This refers to the 1947 border creation event that divided the subcontinent into the countries of India and Pakistan. This border creation displaced 10 to 12 million people and led to widespread sectarian violence. Historical trauma events, like partition, can impact communities for generations. In my research, I'm specifically interested in responses to historical trauma events that can get embodied or get under the skin. One way historical trauma events can be embodied is through epigenetic effects. Epigenetic mechanisms are things that can change gene expression without changing the DNA itself. So everyone has DNA, and your DNA is divided up into genes, and when those genes are expressed, they make proteins, and those proteins make up your phenotype or your physical being. But genes don't work like a switch. They work more like a dial. So they work more like a dial. So what your DNA or your genotype does is it sets the dial. And what epigenetic mechanisms do is it turns the dial in either direction, which affects how much gene is expressed, which affects how much protein is produced, which affects your physical being. Trauma is associated with epigenetic change in a variety of ways. Epigenetic changes are particularly interesting because they're plastic, meaning they can change within a lifetime. They're affected by the environment, whether that's your socio-political environment, your economic environment, or your physical environment. And they're also heritable, meaning they can be passed down from generation to generation. Trauma is linked to epigenetic effects that change genes related to fight or flight response. This can lead to many negative health outcomes, particularly cardiovascular disease and cognitive impairment. In my research, I'm particularly interested in survivors of partition. So I'm working with survivors of partition to look at their epigenomes through blood samples. And I'm correlating to this to oral history or personal narrative data, which will give us a better understanding of the kinds of environmental stressors they're facing. And I'm comparing this data to their children's data so we can have a better understanding of how geopolitical events like partition can affect communities for generations. Thank you.